I have a Gumby cat in mind. Her name is Jenny Anydots. Her coat is of a tabby kind, all tiger stripes and leopard spots. All day she sits upon the stair, or on the step, or on the mat. She sits and sits and sits and sits, and sits and sits and sits and sits, and sits and sits and sits and sits, and that's what makes a Gumby cat. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Guide London live broadcast. My name's Pepe Martinez, and I'm a member of the Association of Professional Tour Guides, one of 600 members actually, and we manage these Guide London live broadcasts and the Guide London website. If you're joining us today, wherever you're joining us from, do let us know in chat, and we'll give you a little shout out at the end if we get time. And if you're joining us for the first time, have you subscribed to our YouTube channel yet? We've got more than 700 subscribers now, and I believe we get a free toaster here at the Guide London office if we get more than 1,000. So make sure you log on to the YouTube channel and press that subscribe button. For those of you that are joining us, again, you've joined us before, you know that every week since the first lockdown last year, we like to cover different parts of London and British culture, be it museums or famous iconic people from literature like Charles Dickens or even Florence Nightingale. But this week, we're going to do a slightly different tour. Today, we're going to go looking around London for the felines, the cats of London. And to help us with our little journey, I'm going to introduce you to one of my esteemed colleagues, Russell. So over to you, Russell, and take it away with the cats of London.
Thank you so much, Pepe. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from London. My name, as Pepe said, is Russell, Guide Russell. And I've been guiding about 5 years now. I've been very proud to be a Guide London member all that time. And what we're going to be doing today is a little excerpt from one of the many virtual tours that I've been doing over the last sort of year or so. And I'm going to introduce you to real cats, imaginary cats, fictional cats, legendary cats, some of the cats you can find if you know where to look all around London. So the first cats lived amongst humans around about 9,000 years ago. So just when humans first started with agriculture, that encouraged, as they built their grain stores, that encouraged mice into the area, and the mice brought the cats, and the cats realized that if they were useful to humans, they'd get a bit of food, a bit of shelter, maybe a nice warm lap to live on. And cats have been living amongst humans ever since. So humans didn't domesticate cats like they did with dogs. Cats essentially domesticated themselves. Nowadays, there are about 600,000 or so cats living in amongst us humans here in London. And there have been cats in this city right back since Roman times. You know that in Londinium, there were plenty of cats around. And in Samuel Pepys's time, so in the 1660s, when he was writing that diary that he was so famous for during the Great Fire of London, he actually mentions a cat during the fire. He says that he saw a poor cat taken out of a hole in a chimney joining to the wall of the Exchange, with the hair all burned off, yet alive. So this poor little fella obviously used up one of his 9 lives escaping from the Great Fire of London. So that's historical cats. What about cats today? Well, maybe the most famous cat living in London today, his name is Larry, and he has a very fine address indeed. He lives at number 10 Downing Street, the home and office of the British Prime Minister. There have been cats at Downing Street for many years. Because the building is so old, I mean, it dates back to 1682, number 10 Downing Street. So perhaps unsurprisingly, it has a problem with sort of vermin and mice and things like that. And a civil servant by the name of A.E. Bannon wrote a memo in 1929 saying that a penny a day from public funds could be allocated for the provision of an efficient mouser. And a cat by the name of Peter arrived a little while later. In the 1960s, during Harold Wilson's time, we know that a memo was sent round by the head of the civil service saying that people should stop feeding little tidbits to the cat as it was becoming inordinately fat, lazy, and an embarrassment. Now, in the late 1980s, a cat by the name of Humphrey arrived as the Downing Street cat at number 10 Downing Street during Margaret Thatcher's, the last days of Margaret Thatcher's time. You can see him on the left there. He was there all the way through John Major's time, but Humphrey left in 1997, just as the Blairs arrived. Sherry Blair was forced by many newspapers to deny vehemently that she didn't like cats and was responsible for Humphrey's exit, but Humphrey did go. In the middle, there's Sybil, and Sybil was the cat that belonged to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasury Secretary during Gordon Brown's time in the about 2009. And Sybil, as her name, she was named after Mrs. Fawlty from Fawlty Towers. Sybil, it must be said, didn't settle terribly well in Downing Street, and Maggie Darling, Alistair Darling's wife, took her back to Edinburgh, where she remained. And on the right there, well, that's Freya. Now, Freya was the cat that belonged to George Osborne, his wife Frances, and their 2 daughters when they lived in Notting Hill, before he became Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2010. Now, Freya was a bit of a wild one. She'd gone missing several times while they lived in Notting Hill, but she came to Downing Street with them. But again, she didn't really like it. It was a bit too urban for poor Freya, and she kept running away, and eventually she was shipped out. And that left Downing Street to be dominated by the cat that lives there at number 10 Downing Street. And almost exactly 10 years ago, on Valentine's Day 2011, David Cameron, Prime Minister at the time, goes to Battersea Cats and Dogs Home, and he picks out this stray, and Larry arrived a few days later. So he is the longest resident at number 10 Downing Street. He's been there over 10 years. He's on his 3rd Prime Minister. Apparently, David Cameron was not very impressed with Larry's mousing duties. He writes in his memoirs that one day he went into his office at number 10 Downing Street, and Larry is curled up on a little chair, and there's a mouse running across the room. And Cameron gave Larry a little prod. He showed him the mouse. Larry looked at the mouse. He looked up at David Cameron, and he curled up and went back to sleep again. But Larry is still very much there today. He loves having his photograph taken. I've got this fantastic photograph of Larry on the windowsill of number 10 Downing Street, famously having his photograph taken there. So there he is, having his photograph taken on the left. There are some people standing in the middle. I'm not even sure who they are, to be honest, but that's definitely Larry there. You can follow him on Twitter. He's got over 450,000 Twitter followers. He's at number 10 cat, if you want to follow Larry. Now, here's probably the most famous living cat. Probably the most famous statues of cats in London sits just up the road from Downing Street at number 10 Downing Street in Trafalgar Square, the Landseer Lions, as they're known. So when Trafalgar Square was laid out and Nelson's Column was built in the 1840s, it was decided that some lions, the emblems of England, should adorn the base of the column to ward off evil spirits, to be the great guardians of Nelson's Column. There was a whole palaver getting them involved. The man that was chosen to do the work of creating these statues, his name was Edwin Landseer. He was a famous painter of dogs and of hunting scenes. He'd never painted a cat before, and he'd never even done a sculpture before. But Queen Victoria loved him. He was very famous, and he got the job. It became something of a national joke, it must be said, the delivery of the lions. Over 10 years passed from when Landseer got the commission to when he actually delivered the lions. He'd never seen a lion before. He actually spoke to London Zoo, and they said, we have a dead lion that we can send you. So they sent a dead lion over to his studio up in Hampstead. Famously, he didn't bother to tell his butler that there was a delivery arriving, and the butler came into his studio and he said, "Mr. Landseer, sir, there's a lion at the door." Anyway, eventually he finished the lions. Eventually they went up, and in 1867, 10 years after he got the commission, the lions finally arrived, and they're there adorning Trafalgar Square ever since. Legend does tell us that if Big Ben ever chimes 13, the lions of Trafalgar Square will come to life and prowl around Trafalgar Square. Now, let's go to the British Museum, where one of the absolute treasures of the British Museum collection, and actually one of the most popular exhibits, is what's known as the Geyer Anderson cat. It's a bronze statue of a cat. It's about 2,600 years old, and it comes from ancient Egypt. It's a depiction of the goddess Bastet, who is depicted either as a cat-headed woman or, as in this case, a full-headed, an actual full cat. It probably came from a temple. In ancient Egypt, what would happen is that rich patrons would buy images of gods and they would donate them to the temple. So there were hundreds, thousands of these sorts of statues in the ancient Egyptian temples. This one here has those lovely gold rings in its ears and a little ring in its nose and a scarab beetle for protection and healing around its neck. Cats were incredibly popular in ancient Egypt. They were valued pets. They kept mice out of the grain stores, and they did have quite a religious significance, as I mentioned. A lot of times what would happen is that people would buy a wooden or other material mold of a cat. They would buy it with a mummified cat inside, and they would have it as their sort of personal deity in their home. The British Museum have got quite a few of these in their collection, and very often when they x-ray them, they find that they're actually empty inside. So it appears what's been happening is that people are being ripped off, that they're buying these objects being told that there's a mummified cat inside, but actually there wasn't anything inside at all. Let's move on. Let's move on to one of the best hotels in London, and it's called the Savoy Hotel, and let's go over there right now.
The cat topiary just behind me is of Casper, and Casper is one of the emblems of the Savoy Hotel. Now, Casper himself is not a real cat. He's a black Art Deco sculpture of a cat. But if you're very lucky, you ask the right questions, Casper could come to dinner with you here at the Savoy.
So here's the story. The year is 1898, and a South African diamond dealer by the name of Joel Wolfe is having dinner at the Savoy Hotel. There are 13 of them having dinner that night. Joel Wolfe is off back to South Africa the next day. At the end of the dinner, while his guests are still finishing up their desserts, Joel Wolfe says, I've got a long journey tomorrow. I need to go. I bid you all farewell. And somebody says to him, Joel, be very careful. When 13 people sit down to dinner, the first person to leave is the first to die. Joel Wolfe doesn't believe any of this. He goes back to South Africa. A week after arriving during a botched robbery, Joel Wolfe was shot and killed. The first person to leave their dinner table that night at the Savoy was the first to die. And so the Savoy instigate this process that if you book a table for 13 at the Savoy, a member of staff would sit and have dinner with you. Now, after about 20 years, it's clear that this really is not a terribly good idea. First of all, it's expensive for the hotel. And secondly, people don't really want a member of staff sitting down having dinner with them. So in 1927, when the hotel was refurbished, Basil Ionides, who was the designer, had an idea, and he commissioned a 2-foot-high Art Deco black statue of a cat, called it Casper. And now, if you have dinner at the Savoy and you book a table for 13 people, they lay a place for Casper at the dinner table, and he sits there and has dinner. So there's never 13 people having dinner at the Savoy. Winston Churchill absolutely loved Casper. In fact, insisted on Casper joining him for dinner, however many people there were having dinner. And when he's not sitting at the dinner table, Casper lives in the lobby of the Savoy Hotel. So when it reopens in a few weeks' time, maybe you're staying there or whatever, just pop in there and have a look, and you can find him just behind the concierge desk waiting for dinner time. But let's move on. Let's move on to our next cat. And to do that, we're going to go to one of the lovely little hidden courtyards of London.
Dr. Samuel Johnson said, if you wish to have a just notion of the magnificence of this city, you must not be satisfied by its grand streets and squares, but must take full survey of its innumerable little alleyways and courtyards. He could well have been talking about Gough Square, where he lived. In fact, he lived in that house just behind me. So it's perhaps fitting that here in Gough Square, we have a statue of his faithful companion, Hodge. In Dr. Johnson's words, a very fine cat indeed.
We don't know a huge amount about Hodge. So there's Dr. Johnson on the left, and there's the statue of Hodge on the right. We don't know a huge amount about Hodge. We know we know that he had black fur, and we know that Dr. Johnson was beloved of Hodge. Dr. Johnson, one of the most amazing figures in the whole story of London. Towering figure of 18th century literature. He wrote pamphlets, he wrote literature, he gave speeches, he was a pamphleteer, and I guess most famously of all, he wrote the first comprehensive English dictionary. Took him about 30 years. He wrote it in his spare time. And Hodge is actually sitting on a copy of the dictionary in this statue of him. The other thing you'll see just to the side of Hodge is an oyster shell. Hodge was very, very fond of oysters. Now, back then, oysters were the food of the poor. They were absolutely dirt cheap. A gentleman of Dr. Johnson's social class would never have eaten oysters, but they were the food of the poor. But because Hodge loved them so much, he had to have them. And this is a real measure of the man of Dr. Johnson. So Dr. Johnson had a manservant. His name was Francis Barber. He was actually a Jamaican ex-slave. But Johnson would never send Barber out to get oysters for Hodge because he didn't want people to think that Barber was buying the oysters for himself and was of low class. So he actually went out and bought the oysters for himself. And so this fantastic little statue, perhaps my favorite cat statue of them all, you'll find that in Gough Square, just tucked at the back behind Fleet Street in the city. But for the final cat in our little story, we're going to go high up on Highgate Hill outside the Whittington Hospital, where you will find the Whittington Stone, and on the top of it, this statue of a cat. It's only about 50 years old, this statue of a cat. And what I love about it is if you look at the face, you can see that the nose is all shiny. That's where people give the cat a little stroke as they go by. So the Whittington Hospital, you might work out where this story is going. For British people, the name of Dick Whittington, or Sir Richard Whittington, as he was when he was a real man and alive back in the 1300s, Dick Whittington is a very familiar story. I know that for people overseas, I know whenever I talk to American clients about this, they've generally never heard of him at all. But Sir Richard Whittington, Dick Whittington, this story, which is kind of part legend, part fable, part biography, it does deal with a real man. But the story that is familiar to us was written down in about 1605, so around about 200 years after the man died. And we go to Christmas, we take the children to the pantomime to see the story of Dick Whittington. This is Charlie Stemper's Dick Whittington in the London Palladium pantomime from a few years back. So the story that we know of Dick Whittington and his cat, he is forever and always and indomitably associated with a cat. So a young penniless lad comes to London, hears the streets of London are paved with gold, arrives in London with his cat, manages to find a job working for an alderman called Fitzwarren. Alderman Fitzwarren has a daughter, but she won't look at Dick because he's far too lower class. Things don't go very well for Dick Whittington and his cat, and they go and they decide to leave, and they walk all the way up Highgate Hill, and they stop exactly where that cat statue stands. And he hears the bells of St Mary Le Bow on Cheapside, and they're calling him back, and he decides to give it one more go, goes back to London. Fitzwarren gives him a job to sail to the Barbary coast with his cat to a land that is plagued with rats. The cat kills all the rats. The king of the Barbary coast gives Dick Whittington a fortune. He comes back, marries Alice Fitzwarren, and becomes Lord Mayor of London. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. So that is the kind of legend of the story of Dick Whittington. It's very similar, actually, to a Persian legend, which tells a very, very similar story. There's an Italian fable from around about the same time that tells the story of a boy and a cat. So how this real man, so Sir Richard Whittington, who was born around about 1350, the 3rd son of an earl, so not a poor boy at all, came to London and became a mercer. Now, a mercer was the top trade in England at the time. He dealt in silk and fur and wool and coal, and he became, Sir Richard Whittington, the richest man in England. He was very close to the king. He was a very canny political operator, obviously. One example of how clever he was as a political operator, he was the #1 wool merchant in England. Wool was the #1 produce of England at the time. He was the biggest wool merchant in the country. He was also, on behalf of the king, the collector of the wool tax, and he was exempt from that tax. So he's obviously playing both ways very well. He makes himself an absolute fortune. He had a wife who was called Alice Fitzwarren. She predeceased him. They had no children, and he left his entire fortune to charity. So perhaps one of the reasons why Sir Richard Whittington's name has lived on is for his great charitable beneficiaries. He paid for improvements to the Guildhall. He paid for improvements to Westminster Abbey. He paid for rebuilding of the Newgate prison, so which did a lot to improve the lot of the prisoners. He built something called Whittington's Longhouse, which did a lot to improve the public sanitation of London. Whittington's Longhouse was a 128-seater lavatory that jutted out over the River Thames. But this question, did he have a cat? The answer is, obviously, we just don't know whether he did or not, and how this association with a cat ever came about. But he is forever linked with a cat. Now, he was a parishioner of the Church of St. Michael Paternoster Royal in the City of London. The church you see in this image was not the church that he was a parishioner of. That particular building was destroyed in the Great Fire of London of 1666. This is the Wren Church that stands on its spot. But there is an image of Dick Whittington and his cat in the stained glass of this building. And look at that churchyard. So the church was quite badly bombed. It was actually hit by a V1, one of the flying bombs during the Second World War. And in the late 1940s, they were doing some digging around the churchyard. And they found the remains of a mummified cat. Was that Dick Whittington's cat? We will never, ever know. So that brings us to the end of my little sort of highlights of some of the cats of London. You can perhaps join me on a full-scale Cats of London tour one day. But for now, I would say if anybody has any questions or comments, see if anybody has anything they'd like to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. That was fabulous. What some great stories. Who'd have thought that you could weave an entire tour just on the cat statues of London? So thank you.
It's almost perfect.
Now, I assume you're a cat man.
I am a cat man. Yes.
Now, I think you did just remind us, what is your favourite animal sculpture in London?
My favourite animal sculpture is probably the one of Hodge, I would say, because it's almost perfectly life size. You can give it a little stroke, and it has this lovely, slightly smiley face, and he's looking rather longingly over at Dr. Johnson's house.
What I love about Hodge is that it's just off of Fleet Street. Fleet Street is very, very normally busy thoroughfare through the City of London, and then literally down a narrow alleyway, opens up into this lovely little square, and it's just like being in a completely different city. So I do hope people do set off to Gough Square to go and find Hodge when they eventually visit London. Now, of course, Russell, you've been doing this as a virtual tour, I believe.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I'm just going to share my screen again to show our visitors your Guide London profile. So if you would like to perhaps have a full virtual tour based around the Cats of London, here's Russell's profile on the Guide London website, guidelondon.org.uk, and apparently it says you're enthusiastic, knowledgeable, engaging, and entertaining, Russell. I
don't know who wrote that.
Yeah, I think our audience will agree, and I think you come from an acting background as well. So
yeah. Back in the day, I was a performer. That's right. Yeah.
Fantastic. So for those of you that have been joining us on a regular basis, you'll know that we launched virtual tours on the Guide London website in June of last year. So if you go to the Guide London website and you click on London Virtual Tour, you'll find our welcome page, and you'll find lots of ideas and suggestions all about some of the virtual tours that you can do. Now, we don't think a virtual tour is ever going to replace the real thing, but whilst travel restrictions are still in place, we hope that they will whet your appetite so that when restrictions are lifted, you can come and visit London and we can show you this stuff in real time, in the real world. Now, we've had visitors from all over the world joining us today, Russell. So I'm just going to let's just do a quick hello to some of them. We've got somebody from Portugal. Hello there. That's Maria Jose Pinto. Nice to see you. Somebody dialing in from Ontario, Canada.
Hi.
Marissa, that's lovely to see you. We've got Michelle, one of our lovely colleagues who's from London. We've got Peter. I'm not sure where Peter's from, but he's saying hello to somebody else. We've got, who else have we got? We've got Celine from Paris. Bonjour.
Bonjour, Celine. Bonjour.
Pew. It was my nickname at school. Yeah, how did I feel about being compared to a French skunk cartoon character? We'll brush over that. But there we go. We've got there we go. So Annalisa, she loves cats.
She loves cats. Good. We're at work, Annalisa.
So Julie, she's dialing in from Liverpool. Hi, Julie. Apparently it's wet.
Hi, Julie. Wet.
Patrizia Roma, one of our Italian colleagues.
Oh, yeah.
She thinks cats are magic. So there we go. So people from we've got somebody in from Venice today. So is it Marianne Angela? Lovely to see you, Mary Angela. You're more than welcome. So ladies and gentlemen, there we go. Just a few people from around the world. Thank you for your lovely comments. So we'll see you again next Tuesday afternoon. Don't forget our address, guidelondon.org.uk. Don't forget to have a look at our London virtual tour portal, and we'll give you some ideas of some of the tours you can do. We have something called Guide Match. You tell us your request, and that will wing its way to Guide London Towers, and hopefully 3 guides will get back to you with some suggestions for virtual tours. So I'm just going to thank you. There's another one of our colleagues.
I had a feeling she was going to say that.
Of course. Let me also put Russell's Guide London profile address up, just for those of you that have missed it. It's been an absolute pleasure to see you all again, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'd like to thank Russell for joining us today, giving up his free time for this presentation. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Stay safe and well, and we'll see you next week at the same time and the same place. Thank you for joining us.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.